Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie, and we're back to do another one of our lessons. This is a very interesting and actually quite a challenging area of the Old Testament to discuss. This is the book of Judges. It's a very difficult time to describe historically. There's essentially no records of the Israelite community or the Hebrew community as they're settling in the highlands beyond one minor reference in an Egyptian bragging by a pharaoh saying how he defeated them. But you can believe those things or not believe them. Some people don't even think translating that as the Israelites is actually accurate. So you don't really know. You have this long period where they're essentially out of the view of anybody else other than their own writings. And they've settled into the highlands after the conquest of Jericho and Ai and a few of the other cities. And they've settled in basically as an egalitarian agrarian society, which means, and they're tribal. Each of the 12 tribes has their own area. They have their own tribal administration. Whatever that is, you don't know. There's really no record. Whether they had hereditary chiefs or rule by the elders, it's just unclear. And they will periodically have areas where they'd be set by an outside or a different non-Hebrew group trying to oppress them. And so you have a series of coalitions of tribes will come together under various charismatic leaders. So in this agrarian society, you don't have a king, so you don't have any royal palace to dig up. You don't have an aristocracy, so you don't have any of their fancy estates to dig up. You don't have any temples to dig up for the archaeologists to dig up now. So the archaeology is very limited. What you do find, though, is a utilitarian house that has appeared from nowhere to matches in about the same time as you can match in the best for the time of the Hebrews arriving. This is called the four-room house. I'll show you a couple pictures of it. And essentially you had 3 long rooms and 1 cross room. You get that?
Yep.
Okay. And that's the 4-room house. You can rearrange the rooms in different ways. Here's some archaeology of the 4-room house. I'll hold it up. You can see. It shows you how limited archaeology is. If you get 3 or 4 feet of the lower part of the wall, you're lucky. Many people think that it probably looked about like this, that it was probably a 2-story structure. And in the long thing across the bottom, they put the animals down there because you wanted to keep them safe. And the 3 other rooms could be chopped up in various ways. Now, this is a people that have a lot of interest in purity. A lot of their laws are based on purity. So this way, having these multiple rooms, you can have storerooms down below, you can have the animals down below, and when the women are menstruating, you can send them off into exile. Sorry about that, ladies. They probably lived up on a 2nd floor. We have no proof of that because all you get is 2 or 3 feet of footer. And they may even have slept up, most likely had slept up on the roof outside, either on an outside 2nd floor area that wasn't covered or up on the roof of the 2nd floor, because in the summer it's so hot there, if no air conditioning, that you sleep outside. So that's all you can find archaeologically. This is probably descended from the workman's house from Egypt. They found one about like this from 1500 BC in Egypt. That's why they brought it in. It's very utilitarian, but again, like I said, without a king, without an aristocracy, you really don't have any other buildings like this. This very basic workman's house of a family, and they're living agriculturally, raising animals, raising crops. Now, the only record we have of this is Judges. And Judges is an interesting book, and it's an account which makes it very clear that when the Hebrews came in, they conquered, but they did not clear out everybody. They did not annihilate the local people, so they had to live among them. And when you live among them, particularly when you came in as a non-agricultural person, you were a nomad from the desert, and you're going to have to learn how to plant crops and raise different animals, you're going to end up having to work with the locals that are already there. The young men will want to marry the local women, and so you end up getting corruption. So there's this long struggle that really, when you time out all the accounts. They say so-and-so did this for 20 years or 40 years. It comes out to about 360, 380 years the Judges covers. And that pretty much covers the time from conquering Jericho, about 1400 BC, until the time of King Saul emerging about 1070, 1060 as the first king. During that whole 360, 380 years, had this loose confederation of tribes that would sometimes get together and sometimes be against each other. And you had these constant struggles with the Baals. Now, the fertility cult at the time is Baal and Ashtart. If you've ever seen models of idols of Baal, he's portrayed as a bull, a storm god. He's strong and resolute and macho. Ashtart is portrayed as the female fertility goddess, often pregnant with a large abdomen, large pendulous breasts. And this is a culture, a religion that is based on an agrarian culture of the fertility cycle. That the sexual relationship between Baal and Ashtart is the secret of the fertility of the land. So in the summer, when the droughts come and the crops stop growing, it's felt that Baal and Ashtart are pulled down into the underworld, and as the rains start to come later in the year, their sexual activity together inspires a return of the fertility and a return of the fertility of the land. So this is an easy and attractive religion for these newcomers because it's rampant sexuality, which is what many people prefer. The Hebrews were one of the very few people that had restrictions on what you could do sexually. So that conflict, and it's wrapped up in the fertility cycle. And they even had sacred prostitutes in the temples for the Baal religion, where men were encouraged to come in and have sexual relations with the sacred prostitutes. So it made it a very difficult competition. Our Christianity has local competition now in our own culture. It's not sacred prostitutes. That sexual misbehavior is part of our culture, but it's not as much of a challenge, I think, to our Christianity as are the other deadly sins that are part of it. Greed, which is a huge one. Pride, a feeling too full of yourself. Wrath or anger. Some people are angry at everybody else. Envy. Those are the deadly sins some of the deadly sins in Christianity. And so we all have our challenges. Theirs was the Baal cult, and ours are the deadly sins that we describe here. So periodically, the corruption would get so bad that God would have to call up, through the divine charisma, a particular chosen leader to fight off the enemies and to restore the faith. And I'll touch on a variety of these that are in there. I won't get them all. And there's the first one of these is Ehud. Ehud is opposing the king of the Moabites. Moab, as you remember, is across the Jordan River and where the country of Jordan is now. And all these various non-Hebrew kingdoms were always trying to encroach on the Hebrew territory, and Ehud is attacking them. Eglon is the king of Moab, and Ehud is defending it, and the king demands tribute, so Ehud gathers up a bunch of tribute and to go in and present it to the king. Now, Ehud is left-handed, and so he prepares a very short sword that he can hide inside his right thigh. Remember, most people were right-handed, so they would check your left leg where you would keep your sword. He's able to smuggle the sword in, and he says he has a special thing for the king, Eglon, who's very fat. In West Virginia, where I grew up and did medicine for a while, they would call this Dunlop's disease. You know what Dunlop's disease is? Where your belly Dunlop over your belt. Have a little West Virginia humor here. And he sneaks the sword out and sticks it in his belly, and he's so fat that the fat comes down and covers the hilt of the sword, so he just leaves it there. He sneaks out through the privies, locks the door, and sneaks out through the privies. His staff of the king can't figure out why he's not coming out, and they use the term, which you need to remember, maybe he's covered his feet. When the term about covering his feet shows up, that means, is he sitting on the toilet? The privy in those days. So that finishes off that king. Another king rises up, and this is Sisera, who is the king of forget where he's the Canaanite king from up north, and he's the bad guy. And God raises up Deborah, a prophetess, a female prophet, and Barak, and they oppose this Canaanite king who's encroaching on their territory. And they have a battle and they defeat him. Barak is the military commander, and the king Sisera runs away after the defeat, and he goes into the house of a woman named Jael, and can he hide there? And he falls asleep, and she takes a tent peg and a mallet and drives the tent peg in through his temple into his brain, and that kills him. Well, that's not a real surprise. And you got to remember, in these primitive agrarian societies, the women had to fight alongside the men because the fighting was desperate. You didn't take prisoners and have a Geneva Convention. You'd kill everybody or enslave everybody. So having women fight is not as unusual in these ancient times as you think. But anyway, that kind of finished him off. The Song of Deborah is included, and like the Song of Miriam from right after the Exodus, these songs of the women are extremely ancient parts of the Old Testament, go back well before the prose text is written. Prose text is written about 500 BC during the Babylonian exile. So that's very, very ancient and very accurate. Then the next one is about Gideon, and this time the Midianites are attacking. They are a bandit tribe from in Sinai. There's bandits in Sinai now. It's so rugged, so it's not a surprise. And they had domesticated camels by that time, so they could ride it out of the desert, move quickly on the camels, and strike, and were quite a very difficult opponent. And Gideon is raised up by the divine charisma to mobilize the tribes to fight these people. And he gathers up thousands of warriors, and the Lord tells him to go through and pick out just the best. So he looks at those who are trembling at the thought of fighting and sends them home. That probably would have been me. Then the next group, he decides to weed. God says to thin them out even further. So they let them get good and thirsty. Then tell them to go down to the river to drink. And so if they put their weapons and shield down and drink like a dog at the river, those are the ones he sends home. But the ones who hold their weapons in the other hand and cup the water up to their mouth like this, that's the 300 that he keeps. So he uses these 300, gets them trumpets or horns, and attack the Midianites at night, surrounding them and defeat them, and drives them away, drives them back across the Jordan, and seizes the fords across the Jordan. Excuse me for talking too fast and stumbling over my words. And then the people say, we should make you king, and he declines. Remember, this is when you still had periodically God would select one of the individuals, give them the divine charisma, and give them the power to lead them against the enemies, and he declines. He says, I don't want to be king, but I want part of your treasure. So he collects a big chunk of the treasure. So now you see the corruption of greed, which was just as much a corrupting factor then as it is now. So he takes this. He's had multiple wives, and he's had 70 children, including an extra one by his slave concubine. Just what you want, 70 children, multiple wives. I don't know why you'd want multiple women. I'm more than happy with one, but that's my own opinion. And so he's got all these kids, and the child he has with his slave concubine is named Abimelech, and Abimelech decides that he wants to be king. And he gets some support from people, so he goes and slaughters all 70 of the other sons, his half-brothers, except for one. And Jotham is the one son, and he survives. And so Abimelech declares himself king. After a few years, the people are getting tired of this because this happens in the warnings that come later in the next other books. that, you get a king, then you get the king being oppressive and brutal and nasty and corrupt and all those things that humans do. And he does that right away. So after about 3 years, various cities are revolting against him, and he goes, including the sacred center at Shechem. Shechem is where the tribes would gather for their annual religious ceremony. It's one of the few civilized areas of this time, actually the only one. And so Abimelech, since they rebel against him, his approach is to go and attack it, destroy it, and kill everybody. Not really kind of a comprehensive, magnanimous leader at all. It just shows when you get a king, they're often brutal and oppressive in this era. So he destroys it, and that does not bring God's favor down on him, that's for sure, because he did not come up from the divine charisma. He came up from his own ambition and his own nasty greediness. And so after destroying the sacred site at Shechem, he's besieging another city. Can't remember the name of it. And he's attacking the city, and there's a woman on the wall, an unnamed woman who takes a large rock and throws it down and hits him on the head. And he knows he's dying, so he tells his armor bearer to kill him because he doesn't want people to say he was killed by a woman. I don't really think it makes much difference whether you're killed by a woman or a man, but it's an interesting story, and the armor bearer kills him. Now, maybe the armor bearer, who knew him well, was more than happy to kill him, to get rid of him, quite possibly. I don't really know that one. And that's the last of the judges of that era. And later on, the whole thing has changed, because about 1250 BC, 1220, there's a big debate, the whole Eastern Mediterranean world collapses. We have talked about this before, but the Greek Mycenaean Greek cities, Mycenae and Thebes and Tiryns and Pylos and Sparta, they all collapse. There's possibly invaders from the north called the Dorians. They could have overrun the cities. The cities could have collapsed on their own. There's a big debate. And I don't really know the answer, and it doesn't really matter, but the Eastern Mediterranean collapses. The Hittite Empire goes poof. It had been strong for hundreds of years, ruling all of Asia Minor, down into Syria, down into the coast near Troy, and it goes poof. And you think, how can this happen? Look back at our own history. When the Soviet Union was on the brink, suddenly their client states in Eastern Europe, Poland and Hungary and East Germany, they all break away, and a year or two later, the Soviet Union collapses, and it breaks up into the Russian Federation ethnically, but Georgia becomes independent, Azerbaijan, the stands out in Central Asia, the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, it all goes poof almost overnight. So when empires go down, they tend to go down just like that. What that produces is this huge power vacuum in the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt survives as an intact government because Egypt is very difficult to break up because everybody lives right along the Nile. And there's a series of people called the Sea Peoples, probably the fighting aristocracy of the Mycenaeans, who take to their boats and they go out and they're raiding and savaging everybody all through the Mediterranean as pirates, buccaneers, whatever you want to call them. Egyptians can fight them off, but they end up settling along the coast of now where the Gaza Strip is, or the Israeli coast, and they become the Philistines. So this is not a Middle Eastern group ethnically. This is a Indo-European group, probably from mainland Greece and the islands, who come and settle in that area. And they become the rivals. The Canaanites disappear as a rival. Moab and Edom are still there, but they become very weakened. And the Philistines, and they are a tough opponent. They have superior technology. They have iron. They know how to work the iron to make superior weapons. And they aren't a one unified group. There's like 5 major Philistine cities, but they're a tough threat. And they become a long-term threat to the Hebrews for several hundred years through the time of King David. And so they're a constant they have the coastal areas, and the Hebrews can't dig them out. And they're really just, Hebrews are now playing defense, trying to keep them from encroaching even further. Now, they are major pork eaters. Mediterranean people really were, like the Romans and the Greeks are. They were major pork eaters. So this probably is the origin of the pork prohibition, that, they were so powerful and wealthy that they tempt the Hebrew people to join their culture. That's probably where the pork prohibition came from, not from a health thing. And so the last part of what we read are the Samson stories. Now, Samson stories are fun, okay? Let's be very clear. He's has these mythical powers. He's so strong and all this, and as long as he didn't cut his hair, which was a Nazarite type of thing, and let his hair grow, then he can do all these things. This seems far more to me, I'll be very honest. I don't have any problem believing the bulk of Judges. I think that's a reasonable explanation of all this tension. Samson seems like fable, kind of like Robin Hood, that they sit around the fires and make fun of their enemies, the Philistines. Because if you think about Samson, his weakness is women. It's always women that are luring him into trouble. He was thinking with the wrong part of his anatomy at this point. And the stories are beyond belief. He ties all the foxes together by their tails, 50 pairs of foxes, and sets fire to the fields. He slays 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. It's great fun. But I think it's more than sit around making up fables about their enemies, because they couldn't beat them in militarily. They were tough. So I like the Samson stories, but and pulling a building over, that sounds a little bit beyond belief. So at this point, this is a very interesting and very difficult part of the Bible to understand. The tribes were loosely confederated. They fought each other, and they would come together to fight against various enemies. They had to fight first the enemies that were already there when they settled: the Canaanites, Moabites, Midianites. And then they had this new enemy coming because of the collapse of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, God produced the collapse of the Eastern Mediterranean, in my opinion, to allow the empires to disappear so that the Hebrews could come together as a nation and have a kingdom under Saul, David, Solomon, these mid-sized kingdoms, when they didn't have the empires pressing in on them. Because a couple hundred years later, when the empires start to press in, first the Assyrians, then the Egyptians, then the Babylonians, that's a great stress on them. So you've got a couple 100-year period that the Hebrews could develop their own culture, their own religion in their own nation. That's a window provided by the Lord who took out these various empires. So we're going to stop here. It's great fun to do this, but it's a challenging thing. What we're going to read next, if you read it, are Ruth, which is a delightful story, probably written over 100 years later, but a delightful story. And 1 Samuel, there's 2 Samuels, 1 Samuel 1 through 7, which is the early part of Samuel. He's the last of the judges. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much. We'll see you in another week.